Anti-communism is a specter within the gaming landscape that's been present for a long, long time. The most noteworthy recent example of it is 2013's Papers, Please, which uses Bolshevik aestheticism to make uninteresting points about American immigration policy for whatever reason. It isn't actually accurate to material conditions in any capacity, but it certainly existed for as long as the medium has. The most baffling and recent example that comes to mind, however, is 2022's Signalis. Signalis is a game that is fraught with many issues. The most glaring of them isn't even its strange anti-communist aesthetic fixations. That would go to its extensive plagiarism of every other survival horror game ever made, and also End of Evangelion and NieR. From entire scenes ripped from Silent Hill 2, to the entire lore and terminology being ripped from NieR, to the entire final dungeon of Silent Hill 1, name and everything mechanically making its appearance as one of the last areas in the game, Signalis blatantly copies its inspirations and adds little, if anything, to them. While there is much to be said about the amount of things that Signalis just straight up steals from, those observations are incredibly easy to make. What less people are talking about is the text's more fascist predilections. Signalis takes place in a hypothetical future where the Soviet Union made it to other planets in space and follows an android woman who's trying to find her lost lesbian lover in one of these aforementioned colonies. We follow their tattered past, one marked by distorted gaps in memory and fragmented jumps in time, warped by distance. There's something beautiful about that. It'd be prettier if it was more directly the focus of the game, but it's still a romantic and heart-rending journey in isolation if you're able to piece it together. This queerness, though it's been done before in other games, is the best part of Signalis' runtime. If that was all there was to the experience, it would be a much better one. But the spaces this queerness occurs in, the propaganda that is Signalis' true main thrust, is what taints this narrative. That and the blatant and consistent plagiarism, of course. Signalis' portrayal of the Deutsche Demokratische Republik as an oppressive regime is the anti-communist aspect of the narrative that seeps into every step you take throughout its spaces. Unlike Papers, Please, which is so cowardly it hides behind a fictionalized version of the country it's using the aestheticism of, the flag of the DDR directly appears within Signalis several times. While the DDR certainly had its issues, as any nation that has ever existed does, it was not the fascist force that this game argues it to be. A particularly comical example of how this game misrepresents the DDR is that the game's limited inventory system, which is largely only present on a design level because it was a feature in the Resident Evil games, is contextualized as being a law on having personal property. Personal property and private property are distinct entities within Marxist socioeconomic theory. Personal property is distinguished as items for personal use, such as toothbrushes, while private property is distinguished as capital or the means of production, such as a factory, which cannot be ethically owned. The DDR did not have many restrictions on personal property, only private property, but Signalis uses both interchangeably to distort the audience's perception. The most compelling critique Signalis makes of the DDR is the game's consistent thematic use of surveillance throughout the text, cameras watching you at all times and being the diegetic framing device for the game's overhead angle. However, even this criticism is one-sided, framing the situation as a lot more paranoid than it actually was. While it is true that the DDR was a highly surveilled state, the material reasoning for this is a lot more sympathetic than something like Signalis frames it as. There were multiple factors to take into consideration in East Germany that need to be kept track of in order to ensure its success. For one, there was Western intelligence constantly trying to invade, and to some degree had already invaded. It didn't help that the CIA had convinced the USSR that they had more of a presence than they actually did within their ranks to scare them. The other pressing threat, however, was consistent pressure from Nazi movements that had to be sufficiently quelled. Nazi resistance was an issue in both East and West Germany that they both had to struggle with ever since the Nazis lost power in 1945, and it's something that has to be continually crushed. It's never totally defeated. It's odd that Signalis takes the umbrage it does with East Germany because, speaking on a queer level, the DDR was on a much more progressive track than most nations in the world at this point in history. Laws against gay and lesbian people weren't enforced after 1957, and by 1968 were completely off the books entirely. Compared to America, which only fully legalized gay relationships nationwide in 2013, this is a far cry from what Signalis depicts as an incredibly stigmatized experience. Homophobia still existed, to be sure. Again, no country is perfect, but not any more significantly than anywhere else, and the impact was certainly lessened by the lack of systemic abuse from the legislature. It's a wonderful thing that Signalis needlessly paints an awful image of. The Deutsche Demokratische Republik was not without its problems. Queer science was still only in its infancy as something legitimately studied, and this led to a lack of understanding on many topics regarding sexuality and transness. Yet it was still better than almost anywhere else in the world at the time due to the widespread legal acceptance of these identities. The critiques Signalis levies at the DDR are ones that largely are not accurate to the material conditions it is critiquing, and even the points that are salient make more sense with context. Signalis is a saddening example of queer art conforming to the neoliberal hegemony in ways that aren't helpful to queerness, perpetuating systems of abuse that incentivize our destruction. While the logic behind the desire to attempt to protect yourself by siding with the oppressor is understandable, it's not respectable. Signalis is just another in the retinue of reactionary queer art. This has been Arcagent Everlasting, who thinks even Silent Hill 3 is a far more queer work than anything Signalis is doing thematically, signing off. Thank you for watching.